When I had travelled to the front in May, I noticed in the train some gentlemen dressed in civilian clothes. It was said that they were members of an international commission who were going to Katyn to examine the traces of the massacre. Katyn lies 20 kilometres to the west of Smolensk. I quote now from Meyer's Encyclopädische Lexikon, 9th edition. At the end of February 1943, German soldiers discovered in mass graves in the forest the bodies of over 4,000 Polish officers. They had been taken as prisoners of war by the Soviets in eastern Poland in September 1939 and had been held in the Kozelsk camp. On the basis of various investigations, including some during the war and some later in the 1950s, the then Soviet government is held responsible for the murders. After German troops evacuated Katyn in 1944, the accusation was made by the USSR that the crime had been committed by the Germans. That was not regarded as having been proven. Significantly, the matter was not dealt with at the Nuremberg war crimes trial. However, at the time, in May 1943, we learned that the written notes found on the bodies ended precisely at a point in 1940, when the Poles were in Russian hands. During the quiet period of trench warfare, it was arranged that as many German soldiers as possible were to be taken to see the mass grave. Therefore, from our company too, a man was designated to visit it. After 3 days he returned and gave us his impressions. He still had the smell of putrefaction in his nose. That was how he closed his account. At the end of July, I suffered another deep disappointment. On regimental orders, I had to leave my platoon and report to the regimental staff at the Führer Reserve. The order came just at the moment when the offensive might start and the enemy open fire. I had my platoon under control. I had won the confidence of my men. The opportunity to prove myself as a frontline officer seemed to have arrived. It was no help at all to me that the commander said, consolingly, that I should be pleased. He said it was a kind of honour, that they wanted to protect me, because they believed me capable of more than commanding only a rifle platoon. I spent the following days in anger and defiance. Still, I was pleased to a certain extent that, by way of compensation, I was assigned to the regimental adjutant. At least I did not have to just sit around on my backside. The activities in the regimental staff and the people who worked there were interesting. Oberst von Eisenhardt-Rothe was tall and gaunt, but I did not see a lot of him, and thus could not get a proper picture of him. After the autumn offensive, he was transferred to the staff of Generalfeldmarschall von Weich in Belgrade. Some time later he shot himself because of a disagreement over a horse. The regimental adjutant, Hauptmann Stockter, was an expatriate German from Mexico and was an actor by profession. Accordingly, he spoke faultless Hochdeutsch, was a lively mimic, and was always a bit over the top. However, he gave me a good introduction to my new job. I studied in detail the entire regimental sector and prepared all the paperwork. I drafted orders and birthday greetings, so I came on paper to address majors as my dear so-and-so. If I imagined something would come of it, I was, at the same time, angry at my foolishness. Had I left my platoon for this? In the evenings, I squatted in the bunker of the pioneer platoon commander, Lieutenant Uxer. He was a Viennese from the Postgasse in the 1st District. I also found another Viennese soldier in the pioneer platoon who was studying piano at the conservatory. Before his call-up, he had been practicing Beethoven's C minor concerto. With Lieutenant Franke, my companion in suffering from the Führer Reserve, I often sang in the bunker. I remember his favourite song, the hit song Sag schön gute Nacht. Franke was a teacher and was getting on for 30. He had an unusually friendly nature and must have been a good man. He had only been married a short time, but was killed in action soon afterwards. On a visit to the 2nd Battalion sector, the commander of the 7th Company, Oberleutnant Becker, offered me a cigarette from a great package of cigarettes of an unknown kind. To my surprised inquiry as to where they came from, he told me that the company had a Bulgarian godmother aunt. She was a rich old lady from Sofia who had lived in Germany and loved Germany since her youth. He said she had selected the 7th Company of the 7th Regiment to be a benefactress to its members. She sent substantial love gifts, and in that way combined her superstitious belief in her lucky number with deeds friendly to the Germans. In the trenches of the 5th Company, and on the barbed wire in front of them, lay 6 dead Russians. They had mounted an assault at dawn. Those who were still alive were driven off by the platoon leader Lieutenant Ast after a short exchange of hand grenades. Lieutenant Ast, an old war horse known throughout the regiment, was tall, had a prominent Adam's apple, and, as befitted his name, gave the impression of being knobbly. He said that it was not worth burying those few, since anyway more would soon be coming. He said a prisoner had told him that the attack was to begin the next day. A complete contrast to Ast was his company commander, Hein. Generally called Freund Hein, at 5 feet in height, he was really small. From his round, friendly face and little eyes, there showered wit and jollity. As I was accompanying Oberleutnant Roprich from the 2nd Battalion of our artillery regiment, Hein gave us a large measure of schnapps because, he said, we were his last visitors before the attack. On the presumed last day before the expected attack, some aircraft were sent in to attack the enemy assembly areas. Some squadrons of Ju-88 and He-111 bombers flew in large numbers and dropped their bombs on the Russians. The Russians had sent up a surprisingly large amount of flak, which maintained uninterrupted fire. One He-111 received a direct hit and disintegrated. We watched it with Oberleutnant Hein in his sector of trenches. Our artillery had also put down fire over the Russians. On the way back to the regimental command post, we passed the firing position of the 8th Battery. The gunners were working stripped to the waist, a lieutenant helping them to load. At the regiment, too, they were working on the basis that the enemy would attack the next day. The Army High Command had given orders to withdraw the sentry outposts during the coming night. That order was as clear as the regimental orders drawn up by Hauptmann Stockter, which closed with the words, "And so, with all our trust in God, we shall do our duty." I woke in the night, roused from my sleep by the rumble of deafening thunder. At precisely 3:40 a.m., the bombardment began from 500 gun barrels. There were howitzers, cannons, light and heavy mortars and rocket launchers. It was as if a supernatural drummer was vertiginously beating his drum. Right there, 2 kilometers behind the main front line, you had the impression that the front-line trenches were being ploughed up. Our regimental command post was at the edge of the woodland, in the hollow behind the artillery firing positions, and all were similarly under heavy-caliber fire. Whenever a 17.2 or 20 cm shell exploded nearby, a shudder went through the ground and among the gigantic spruce trees where our bunkers were scattered. Massive splinters whizzed through the air, crashed into the wood of the trees, and tore terrible gashes in the earth. At 6:20 a.m. there was quiet. It would be seen if the 2.5 hours of murderous bombardment had been effective, if the men in the trenches had survived, and if they were still able to put up resistance. Perhaps the Russians would stroll through the woods unopposed. But only seconds after the barrage had finished, you could hear small arms fire. Through the clear sounds of the Russian machine pistols came the chattering of machine guns belonging to our lads. In the regimental bunker there was plenty to do. All the lines to the battalions, and the lines leading from the battalions to the companies, had been cut by shell fire. The first reports could only be obtained by wireless. Signallers were sent out to repair the telephone lines. We learned that the main line of resistance had held in an outstanding manner. In the 10th Company, Schorsch Henschel, only just promoted to Hauptmann, had thrown back the Russians in a counter-attack. Only on the post road had they penetrated into the remnants of the village of Ivanovo. There, the badly wounded Oberleutnant Malwitz was encircled with only parts of the 6th Company. Behind the battalion command post of 2nd Battalion, the enemy had been brought to a halt. A counter-attack by 1st Battalion had a certain amount of success. From our reserve bunker I had seen parts of the battalion that had been in reserve moving forwards. Oberleutnant Klaus Nicolai, commander of the 3rd, and Fahnenjunker Unteroffizier Eberhard Kern were with them. Kern limped because his right big toe was missing since the winter of 1941, but he preferred to be there at the front rather than at home. Towards midday, after sending back many wounded, Lieutenant Ast came back, shot through the shoulder. "The damned sods," he swore. He said that, to be sure, the Russians had broken into his trench as they had the day before, but had been thrown out again by him and his men. It was said that during the 2.5 hours heavy barrage of the 6th of August, the Russians fired 50,000 shells on the division's sector. They then attacked with 9 infantry divisions and 2 armoured brigades. In front of the regiment's main line of resistance, and in the places where they had broken through, 3,000 dead Russians were said to have been counted. Oberst von Eisenhardt was proud of his regiment's achievements. He drove to the front every day, standing in his Kubelwagen. My request that he should take me with him one time, he declined. He said that I would get there soon enough. In the meantime, Lieutenant Franke had left, and I was the last of the Führer Reserve to be with the regiment. Again, I had a disappointment. I received an order to ride to a village 10 kilometres behind the regimental command post. My task was to guide baggage trains through a busy junction. They were to be moved further to the rear. It was the village in which, before the attack, the division's Pioneer Battalion and Panzerjägerabteilung had been located. So in a peevish mood I rode overnight to the rear, accompanied only by a chap from the regimental riding platoon. When we reached the highway, a Soviet aircraft was already clat-tearing over us. Expecting to be bombed, I was holding the horse on a very short rein, and managed to control it. But then a bomb fell very close by, and the nag, terrified by the crash and the lightning flash of the impact, bolted with me, so that I had great trouble bringing it under control again. After I had guided the baggage trains through the junction, as ordered, and before riding back, I looked for the commander of the self-propelled gun company. He was proud of his men's successes. Of the almost 100 tanks destroyed in front of the division's sector, a large number was down to them. However, the fact that the baggage was being moved to the rear was a sure sign that the front was soon to be pulled back. The surest sign was my new mission, to go as adjutant to the trench construction staff of the division, who had been hastily formed. I learned from the divisional history that, under the code name Panther, it was intended to withdraw, within 2 weeks and in 2 stages, from the Buffel position to the Panther position. The new line ran approximately along the line Jelnya-Dorobush-Spasdemensk. The final position ran approximately along the line Gomel and the course of the Pronya-Lenino east of Vitebsk. The division's Stellungsbaustab, that is trench construction staff, was under the command of Hauptmann Müller. Until then he had been commander of our 2nd company. Müller was a tall, good-looking man, with dark brown eyes and hair and heavy eyebrows. Oberst von Eisenhardt called him Glowing Eyes or Greyhound Müller, and in actual fact his appearance could remind you of a noble greyhound. As a student at the Tharent Forestry College near Dresden, he had got the daughter of a professor pregnant and married her forthwith. At the time, that went without saying. You could well imagine that he was inclined to be extravagant, even though he had his Batman write his letters to his wife. The Batman was Obergefreiter Petzold. He had been brought along and used as the clerk. The staff also included an officer from, respectively, the artillery, the Panzerjäger, and the pioneers. The officer of artillery was the congenial Oberleutnant Rauprich, whom I had got to know before the attack. Müller and I determined the course of the trenches in accordance with the infantry point of view that regarded the representatives of the other service arms as providing the supporting weapons, so to speak. In that scheme, Rauprich's task was to fix the points for the B, that is, the observation positions for the forward artillery observers. We had at our disposal an Adler-Trumpf Kubelwagen, in which we drove around the terrain. The driver was Obergefreiter Morawiecz, who had been detached from our 14th Company together with his vehicle. The actual work on constructing the trenches was carried out by the division's so-called Baubataillon, of which I will speak later. That battalion also included 2 horse-drawn mobile columns. One was commanded by the dark-skinned elderly Hauptmann Fokker, a Sudeten German and an hotelier by profession. In the evening, when I was issuing orders on behalf of my Hauptmann, I felt like the proprietor of a small construction business, planning from day to day how best to use his foreman, his workers, and his materials. My displeasure over the lost opportunity to prove myself in a large-scale action had vanished, and I was even then able to see good points in the businesses of trench construction. It was not to be sneezed at that here at the rear. You could sleep at night, take off your tunic and even your trousers. That was all the more the case since calm had returned to the front line. I had not had it so good for a long time. Our base was in the little village of Liadi, and we lived in a clean 2-roomed farm cottage. The man of the family had been with the Red Army since the beginning of the war. Since then, his wife had heard nothing from him. She did not know whether he was still alive, but bore it with resignation and equanimity. In a corner of the room stood the icon. It had always been there, even under the Bolsheviks. The village commissar had made fun of it, but otherwise found no fault in it. But the villagers had not taken him seriously, said the woman. In a frame without glass were stuck some photographs, including a picture of a dead person of a kind known in Russia. The relatives were crowded round the dead man, in an open coffin. The women were wearing headscarves and the men long white wide smocks. The woman lived alone with her child on the small estate. The girl, perhaps 11 years old, was called Shenia. Mother and child had brown eyes and brown hair. The child had an innocent angel's face. We were touched to see how her face lit up when we gave her some of our scanty confectionery. She was amazed, as was her mother, at the pictures we showed her from home. The woman gave us a lot of the bread that she regularly baked. It was coarse, moist, heavy, and full of spelt. We knew that in doing this she was treating us as her guests, and we gave the two of them what we could spare. The attractions of our construction sector were the Vyazma-Jelnya railway line and a collective farm that lay in front of the future front line. The extensive state property was administered by an agricultural Sonderführer. He had a couple of Landesschützen to provide military cover. For the rest, he had obviously lived up till then like a king. The yield was poor, he said. There was a shortage of workforce and machines to work the land more intensively. In front of the farmhouse was a ravaged German military cemetery from 1941, which partisans had destroyed. I wondered why the Sonderführer had not had it restored. On the 22nd of August, Rudy's 18th birthday, I got a concerned letter from Mother. She wrote that for about a week, mention had been made every day in the army news reports of west and southwest of Vyazma, and she suspected that they were talking about the district where I was. On top of this, she said, mention was made once of a Silesian infantry division. Was this mine? She asked. She was obviously worrying about me more than she needed to, but how could I have said to her that her worries, at least for the moment, were unfounded? A few days later, there was great consternation among the inhabitants of the village. The Starets, the village elder, had got news that the 18-year-olds, born in 1925, were to be rounded up and sent to forced labour in the Reich. Since all the young men were with the Red Army, only 3 girls were affected. No one could respond to the village elder's plea for help. It could not even be ascertained from which authority he had received the order. The countryside around Liadi could, in different circumstances, have been described as lovely. Woodland, bushes, marsh, meadow, and a small river in a deep gully offered a constantly changing picture. Seen with a soldier's eye, the terrain had disadvantages, and in places was even shitty. Several hundred square metres of undergrowth had to be rooted out to provide a field of fire. In another place, the unavoidable change from the position on the upward slope to that on the downward slope presented a puzzle. The problem would only be able to be solved by the relevant sector commander deploying outpost sentries. He would not be envied. The comrades would not be edified over some irreparable corners that would involve close-quarters combat. In our walks over the terrain, stepping through some tall bulrushes, we came across parts of a human skeleton. The gnawed bones, shining and bleached by the sun, had evidently been scattered over a wide area by birds. The skeleton had to be that of a soldier killed in action in 1941 in the fighting in the Yelnya Arc. But it was not a German, but a Russian. A little further on we found the hollow skull, still covered with a Russian helmet and with the chin strap under the chin. However, we had no time to reflect on the mythical image of a soldier's death. In looking around for more bones, I noticed 2 half-overgrown square plywood boxes in the form of oversized cigar boxes. They were more or less covered with moss and overgrown. They were Russian anti-tank mines. We had stumbled into an old minefield. Virtually on tiptoe we felt our way out of the field, using the open areas as if on a chessboard to get out of danger. Those mines would make the trench construction work considerably more difficult. At any time, members of the work units could stumble across mines, and vehicles drive over them. Casualties were to be expected. In the absence of a precise map, danger loomed practically everywhere. In addition, we would not even be able to give a guarantee to the unit that would next move into the position that the area to their rear was free of mines. If it were only a matter of anti-tank mines requiring the imposition of a certain minimum weight before they exploded, the danger would have been less. but there was no reason to assume that that was the case. As if to confirm our worry that there were also anti-personnel mines in the area, one day after the minefield was discovered, a vehicle from the light column drove over a mine on a road and was blown to pieces. In another place, a Russian civilian stepped on an anti-personnel mine. Afterwards, the poor devil must have lain the whole night, far away from anyone, with his foot blown off, and so met his death. Inspection of the place where the horse-drawn vehicle had driven over the mine revealed that the tyre tracks of my Kubelwagen were only 10 centimeters away from them. A special angel must surely have been holding his hand over Morawiecz. I ordered him from then on only to use well-worn tracks. Some days later, I was a guest of Hauptmann Kriegel, the commander of the famous Baubataillon. He lived alone in a little house. He did not have a batman, but instead was served by a local woman. Vera was a nice and intelligent technical draftswoman from Bialystok. She made no secret of her Bolshevik convictions and her belief that the Soviet Union would win the war. But this did not prevent her from living with Kriegel, who was in his mid-40s, in a relationship similar to marriage. Vera was chubby-faced, red-cheeked, had an ample bosom, and was always in a good mood. Even if those characteristics were not in her nature, she would have had every cause to be cheerful because the only work she was required to do was to look after Hauptmann Kriegel. Not only I, but also the local commander, was struck by the shameless outspokenness with which Kriegel defied our notions of clean living and marital fidelity. Moreover, it was the same with the men under his command. The civilians were all women and young people who were not particularly kept under watch, but merely supervised by members of the regimental band. I heard then that every one of these Feldwebeln and Unteroffiziere, active military musicians, was said to have had a wife among the women workers. The sobering realization for me was that even among us there was luxuriousness in the lines of communication, and that these Etappenschweine, who had left their mark so deeply in the literature about the First World War, had evidently still not been eliminated by the spirit of the new Germany. Still, I also participated in the amenities of the lines of communication when Kriegel had cow's liver prepared and had roast goose served to the members of the trench construction staff. During the meal, Kriegel told of a man from the company whom he had had under his command at the beginning of the Russian campaign. That man, shot through his skull through both temples, had not only lived to tell the tale, but had been returned to the active list. Around the 10th of September, the trench system of the Hubertus position was practically completed, and there came the order to move the staff to the rear. Hauptmann Müller had to go up the line to take over command of a battalion of Regiment 461. With him went his batman, Obergefreiter Petzold, who looked like a middle-aged official, that is about 35. Petzold even wrote his boss's letters to his Ehemädchen, as Müller called his young wife. While Müller and I were out in the field fixing positions, Petzold would write precise descriptions in clear script, like the company secretary of a building concern. In doing so, he always spoke of us, and wrote in the name of we, and Müller signed the letters after adding a short personal note. The young wife soon had to mourn for her husband, because Müller was killed in action the following November at Neville. He was said to have been shot through the neck, and thus to have bled to death. For a few days, Oberleutnant Grebsch took over command of the staff. He was an extremely ambitious, impersonal and unfriendly man in his early 30s. By profession, he was an optician from Beuthen. When he left, I took over command of the staff. At that time, an armoured train used to travel on the railway line near the State Farm. It was said to have been captured from the Russians in the 1941 advance. Certainly, I had no idea how that train was adjusted to run on European gauge tracks. It was equipped with German anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, and it was interesting to inspect it. But it was no place to be for an infantryman. We did not feel at all happy in such a steel coffin. We preferred a trench in the womb of Mother Earth. The front was on the move again. We knew that because the roads in our sector began to fill with baggage trains. The baggage troops were supposed to carry in their vehicles only things that were important for the war effort, such as ammunition, food, and fodder. But I saw a lot of other things that the high-ups were, still bringing with them. There was upholstery on lorries with women sitting on top. Their lordships could make themselves really comfortable again at their next location. They had everything you need, was man brocht, as the song goes. For a long time there had been much air activity, Enemy bombers, fighters and reconnaissance aircraft were hampered by a few aircraft of our Luftwaffe. It was said that Novotny, the fighter pilot, my fellow countryman from Vienna, was in action in that area. If it was he, then on that day I saw 3 aircraft shot down by him. It was the day on which we left our cottage in Liadi. Xenia and her mother, the warm-hearted, artless woman, had tears in their eyes when we said farewell. The withdrawal of the front pushed my trench construction staff ahead of it. In the villages there began a fight for quarters. Sometimes I had trouble in claim, in a room just for my staff activities. I could find no other way of doing it than to scatter maps over the entire floor of the room in order to distinguish the importance of our work from that of the various baggage units. Only when up against a main dressing station, the place where a regiment's wounded were treated, did I quite rightly have to give way. But I was more than a match for other lines of communications units in asserting our importance to the fighting troops. The people from the bakery, workshop and other companies could sleep outside in the fine summer weather, or, if it rained, put up tents. But I could not have my trench diagrams prepared in the rain. Line by line, trench by trench, I laid them out. Our civilians had to almost double their daily output. One officer after the other was taken away from the trench construction staff and went back up the line. I was then the specialist for observation positions and artillery gun positions. Often I only had time, as I stood in the vehicle, to draw the line of the trench, using the wheel tracks. The trench was then dug out following in my track. My eye for the terrain had become so sharp that even with such provisional procedures there were never any blind corners. The roads that I encountered on my journeys around the terrain were the routes of retreats, with all the signs of retreat. Abandoned vehicles, carts with broken wheels, destroyed equipment, bomb craters, shrapnel and many dead horses lined them. There were horses with bloated bellies and glassy eyes, and their cadavers spreading a pestilential stench. In Russia, 2.7 million horses were deployed by the German Wehrmacht. Of those, 1.7 million fell victim to the war. They too we considered to be our comrades. Many of us were cut to the heart when a horse was wounded and, gripped with deadly fear, it faced the bullet that would put it out of its misery. From then on, each day I expected an order dissolving the trench construction staff. Everything was, in a way, flowing to the rear. Land and people seemed to be on the move. The front, the lines of communication, and parts of the Russian civilian population were flooding back. Other civilians were setting off eastwards again. Evidently they wanted to walk through the lines, or take cover, and let the retreat pass them by. When a couple of women from the Bau Battalion wanted to stow away, the Musikfeldwebel fired a couple of times into the air, whereupon the Mankas hastily turned round and told their guardians they were sorry. Anyone who wanted to become a Prussian officer knew that the way to that goal was no bed of roses. He knew that before it was his turn to be allowed to give orders, he had to learn to obey and would be drilled more than the others. Walter was the son of a blacksmith from Reichenbach in the Eulengebirge. For him, the career of an officer offered an unparalleled opportunity to rise in the world, for the inspiring prospect of being able to become an officer with his field marshal's baton in his knapsack. He, whose father was serving as master blacksmith in a baggage train, would have taken upon himself more than such trivial and short-lived moments of disapproval. For him it was true when he said, "Wer auf die preußische Fahne schwört, hat nichts mehr, was ihm selber gehört. Whoever swears on the Prussian colours no longer has anything he can call his own." At New Year 1941, he had had 1 over the 8 in the officers' mess in Merchingen. A comrade, just as drunk as he was, smeared boot polish on his face. After réveillé for the New Year parade, 2 hours later, he had trouble getting rid of the biggest smears. The half-hour march through Merchingen with dressed rifle had been a sobering experience for us all. On our return to the barracks, the commander of the ersatz unit carried out the inspection of the New Year parade, but since the old man was obviously sozzled himself, he had not, luckily for Walter, discovered Walter's face covered in boot polish. So, at least that time, Walter did not attract attention. But then, in September 1943, I realized he would never again rub his sleepy eyes and, as he once did, enthusiastic and happy, shout down from his bunk into the room, imitating the radio announcer, "Good morning. Today is Tuesday, the 6th of September, 1943. It was about the 20th of September when I took over command of the 10th Company that I had left at the beginning of August as a platoon leader. The company had shrunk to less than the size of a platoon. I arrived in the middle of the withdrawal. At that moment the Russians were not pressing, and the withdrawal movement could proceed by day. Reconnaissance patrols, tentatively feeling their way forward, could be seen through the binoculars. Since the type of terrain allowed it, we withdrew in broad formation just as we had advanced to attack in the opposite direction. A line of field grey, a kilometre wide, was striding over the steppe-like landscape. The men were holding their rifles over their cartridge cases, the gun barrels, like their faces, lowered. From time to time, officers stopped, turned round, and looked through their binoculars. Like an unfolded fan, drawn along by an invisible hand, we left the silent land behind. We could not suppress a feeling of saying farewell. Having been ordered to, I had to look around once more in order to scout out a village that was slightly to the side of our route. I had to see if it was occupied by the enemy. When I arrived within 300 metres of the village with my 2 volunteers, we came under rifle fire. Bullets whizzed into the damp grass. It was friendly of the Ivans not to let us come any nearer to the edge of the village. But because of that, our task was quickly done. We had ascertained that the village was occupied by the enemy and were able to withdraw, darting from side to side. It was not easy because the terrain offered no cover. The division's route led southward past Smolensk. I could no longer hope to be able to visit the town a 4th time. I regretted my laziness that had prevented me from looking around properly on my previous visits. I would never again be able to wander up to the Cathedral of the Assumption of Mary, and I would never again be able to sit down against the eastward-facing fortifications of Boris Godunov. That was something which I had always intended to do, inspired by Napoleon's equerry Caulaincourt. Then I should have wanted to look down upon the burning city, just as a Württemberg artillery major had looked in 1812 from the walls of the fortifications. He had seen and drawn it with the mighty towers and delicate battlements. Whoever holds Smolensk holds Russia, was how the saying had gone in those days. Then the city had been alternately Russian, Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian again. To draw lessons from history was not for me at my age. That the fortunes of war had changed was something that I would not have been able to judge. On the night of the 25th of September, we moved through Monastyrshchina. Here and there a house was on fire, and in the light of the fire could be seen a former church and many clean little wooden houses. On the western edge of the little town, we stopped for a short while. There I took over command of the 3rd Kompanie. It too was then only 28 men strong. The 1st Battalion, to which the company belonged, was under the command of Hauptmann Bayer, who in summer 1942 had been my company commander. Bayer was determined to let the exhausted men of his battalion sleep for the rest of that night. For weeks they had only had on average 2 to 3 hours of sleep. Even then all that could be expected was scarcely likely to be more than 4 hours. The next village, Worpajewo, was our destination. Each of the weak companies took a card, and the men who were dead tired immediately fell to the ground. The company commanders still had to go off for a meeting at the battalion. They were told that the withdrawal was continuing, and they would be moving off again in the early morning. The meeting was interrupted by a Feldwebel who had gone down a little way towards the village in order to organize things. God knows what the man had hoped to find. In any event, he reported that out of the darkness he had been greeted with a shout of "Stoi," whereupon he had withdrawn. This was obviously a damned nuisance to Hauptmann Bayer, because he said in his dry Berlin way, "Oh, get away with you, man. They were volunteers whose nags had bolted. Stop the bother." None of those present could bring themselves to contradict him. They did not want to disturb the longed-for peace and quiet. I assigned the watches and lay down with my men on the flat, tiled floor, my head in the hollow of my steel helmet. At 3:30 a.m., the time we were ordered, the battalion assembled on the village street, the companies in ranks, one behind another. We were not even out of the woods when shots whipped along the village street. Men were falling, others were crying out. Panic took hold of the mass of men, who were still drowsy with sleep. Everybody was running and no one was listening to my command. As I ran, I snatched a machine-gun belt from the ground and hung it round my neck like a scarf. During the 1-kilometre flight, I turned round several times and saw some cavalry and infantry, perhaps dismounted Cossacks. It was incredible that a handful of enemy had actually put us to flight. But still there was no stopping. Some swine of a machine gunner had dropped the belt that I was then carrying round my neck. Another whom I overtook, I caught throwing away a box of ammunition. "You lousy sod," I bawled at him, and gave him a kick in his behind. When he picked the box up again, I kept him with me with the intention of getting hold of a machine gun. But still the mass of men had not been brought to a halt. I saw the battalion medical officer, Dr. Kolb, shot down as he was struggling to bring a machine gun into position. A quiet, unheroic man had done what it was our job, the troop officers, to do. Violent rage seized me. Finally I managed to get hold of a machine gun and the two gunners. I snapped at them. "We three are now staying here, even if we have to die here. Do you understand?" "Jawohl, Herr Leutnant," they answered, shocked. Behind a low rise in the ground we went into position. With a few spadefuls the machine gun position was improved and a small amount of cover was produced. In the complete calm that then gripped them, the two machine gunners carried out their well-drilled handling of the weapon. The Russians were leaving some time before they followed up. The last stragglers of the battalion passed. Then the first gunner let fly with his first bursts of fire. The Ivans went to ground and disappeared behind undulations in the ground. 15 minutes later the formation of the battalion was re-established. Hauptmann Bayer had had a line drawn up. When at last the first machine gun began to chatter behind us, we three were able, alternately running and jumping, to withdraw to the battalion line. AMG 42 and 15 men were all that was then left of my company. We crossed the highway from Smolensk and the anti-tank ditches that ran to the west of it. In the next village, my company and I had to remain behind another 2 hours, as a rear guard, until 2 p.m. On both sides of the village and the road along which we were withdrawing was open steppe. Whether and where there were rear guards was unknown. In front of the two houses, right and left of the village street at the outskirts of the village, I had a start made on digging foxholes. The comrades were not so keen on digging, and said that we would have to weather out the 2 hours over midday. I gave way to them, and we left it alone. For an hour, everything remained quiet, and no enemy showed themselves. A man kept a lookout, while I sat with some others on the bench in front of the house. The sun was shining, and the autumn sky was a cloudless blue. In that contemplative position I stretched out my legs in front of me, pushed my hands into my trouser pockets, and nodded off. Out of a deep sleep of only a few minutes, I was wakened by shots. The sentry ran up and made his report. From the hollow with the anti-tank ditches at the side of the highway, he said that cavalry had appeared. They had turned round when he fired on them and disappeared back into the trenches. The tense waiting and watching lasted about a quarter of an hour, until the cavalry once more came out of the hollow. They were wearing brown Russian uniforms, but with square caps on their heads. First there were 10, then 20, and then more and more, all forming up into a front, and at a gallop storming up to our village. It must have been a squadron of about 100 coming closer and closer. The anachronistic picture fascinated and hypnotized me. The last time that Cav Alry had attacked was the Polish cavalry in the Poland campaign, but in seconds I was awake and gave my order. It could only be to fire at will. They had already approached to within 300 meters of us, when from the right flank, apparently from a neighboring village, the flak of an unknown unit opened fire. While at first only individual horses reared and only a few cavalrymen fell, our rifle fire too was then beginning to hit. The remnants of the 100 or so drove down on us in a confused tangle. We had climbed out of the foxholes and were firing at will into the mass of them. The attack collapsed, and soon riderless horses were chasing over the field. Some cavalrymen managed to turn round and to reach the hollow. Dismounted wounded Cossacks dragged themselves back. Injured horses were lying on the ground and thrashing about, whinnying. Because we had to save ammunition, we ceased fire, and fired no more after the stricken cavalrymen. The main responsibility for our success doubtless belonged to that flak unit. It certainly had rescued us from an uncertain fate. But the episode reminded me of those Cossacks who with their skirmishing wore down Napoleon's Grande Armée on the retreat from Moscow. Soon after we had evacuated the village as ordered, we passed a herd of cattle. While the animals were grazing on unsuspectingly, the machine gunner let fly some bullets into the herd. It followed the order that nothing that could sustain life was allowed to fall into enemy hands. Anywhere that could be used for AC accommodation was to be burnt. Food, weapons, and equipment were to be destroyed under the name of scorched earth. That followed the example set by the enemy in 1941. I was back once again with the unit. After a fortnight during which I had my boots on day and night, my feet were so swollen that I was not able to get the boots off. I had ordered that the Kuchenbulle should bring me a pair of rubber boots and footcloths with the food vehicle. When he brought what I had asked for, the operation could begin. I had feared that the boots would have to be cut off, but things went well. 4 men got hold of me, 2 of them pulled at a boot each, and 2 of them held me by my shoulders and arms. As if they had wanted to pull me into 4, they pulled me apart in opposite directions. But it worked, and my swollen, filthy limbs were free. Meanwhile, the autumn had begun. The so-called mud period was imminent. If it was not raining, the days were still hot, but during the night the temperature fell by 20 degrees. We were freezing, and the oldies were no longer so easily dried. To warm ourselves, we hoped for burning villages. Units operating in the rear saw that the villages to be evacuated were burnt to the ground. Night after night was bright. From the glare of burning settlements, we would have been able to recognize our direction of march, even if we had not ourselves possessed maps and compasses. It seemed remarkable that the earth on the road along which we were retreating was burnt. It was not as if we had burned our bridges behind us. I remember stopping one night in a burning village. While we waited in front of the fire, we dried our feet in the warmth of the glow and rubbed our hands as a kind of recuperation. It seemed as if a watchfire of Prince Eugen was warming us and illuminating the scene. For a short time, we behaved as if the enemy were not already close behind us. We fancied ourselves in peace and security. All that remained of the entire battalion, officers and men, stood around the burning beams. We stared into the glowing element, smoked, drank schnapps or tea from our field flasks, chatted or reflected on our forthcoming departure. Wood and straw crackled, and the horses of other units snorted uneasily. In the warm air from the fire you breathed in the musty smell of old wood and rotten straw. Only the lime oven with the chimney resisted the fire. It did not yet rain for days and nights on end, but in fits and starts, and for only hours at a time. But that was enough to swell the streams. Where otherwise the water might have reached to our ankles, we had to wade through fords up to our knees, or up to our bellies. In the twilight, I observed a battery crossing. The path led steeply down to the water, and just as steeply back up again on the other side. It was time for the gunners to get their horses to give it all they had. With Caracho, as we said at the time, the team of 6 stormed up the stony path. "Gallop," was the command. The gunners in the saddle hit at the horses, and those who were sitting on the gun carriage clung to each other. While the rain spattered on the water of the swollen stream, the dauntless animals dragged the teams with the howitzers through it and up the slope on the other side. It was a kaleidoscope of power and movement that an artist might have been able to fix on paper. A new platoon leader joined our company for 48 hours. Lieutenant Bertram, who was about 40 years old, was a 12-ender, recognizable by the 2 blue bands. He had only recently been caught by the Heldenklau. That was what the commissions were called, who were combing through the home front troops to find men who were capable of serving at the front. He had served in General Meltzer's company when Meltzer was still a Hauptmann in the 100,000-man army. But then, that was no use to him. His parade ground snappishness, his dreadful Saxon and his clear air of anxiety cheered us up. As suddenly as he had come, he disappeared again for no apparent reason. At that time it was said that the life expectancy of an infantry lieutenant, that is, the time in which he could expect to remain with his unit without being wounded, amounted to 13 days. Lieutenant Bertram's life expectancy had therefore been significantly shorter. On the evening of the 30th of September we crossed the Dnieper, which in its upper reaches was a modest river. I climbed down the bank, thirsty. I scooped some up with the hollow of my hand. I had drunk water that tasted of the earth. On the western, steeply climbing bank, we found a position ready constructed. It proved to be a considerable disadvantage that the trenches ran at a point halfway up the incline. There it had been hoped to stabilize the front. The trenches had been drawn in such a way, that blind corners were avoided in the field of fire in front of the position. When we evacuated it in the afternoon, the disadvantage of the position became apparent. The enemy had already occupied the opposite bank and had brought some Ratschbombs into position. With them they could fire AL, most directly down into our trench, which we would immediately have to evacuate again. It was a strenuous and exciting operation to rush uphill in the trench accompanied by the impacts of that unsavoury weapon. After we reached the top, the reason for the sudden order to evacuate became apparent. On the left, to our rear, there were already Russians whom we could see advancing to a bridge. That bridge led over a tributary stream and also had to be crossed by us. As we realised the situation, we ran at the same time as the enemy, racing to see who could reach the bridge first. If the Russians had simply opened fire on us, we would have not reached the bridge alive. But since the enemy did not fire, I did not take the trouble to bring the men to a halt. After the experiences of Woropajewo, I thought that to construct the security position on the other side of the bridge would be hard enough in itself. In the event, I succeeded, but only with difficulty. My voice was hoarse from shouting commands and cursing those running away. A portly Obergefreiter claimed he had a bad heart and had to go back. I answered him that he should not be running, and had all the more reason to stay where he was, rather than go into the position. Then, when the pursuing Russians received our first aimed rifle fire, they gave up their pursuit, and we had quiet until the evening. During the night we retreated further. The company had loaded its goods onto a horse-drawn vehicle. Machine guns, ammunition, blankets, and a couple of men with bad feet were loaded on one wagon as they had on previous nights. The little animal, in itself tough and more efficient than our thoroughbred army horses, was nevertheless at the end of its strength. Through deep mud and over bumpy corduroy roads, it pulled with its last ounce of exertion, urged on by cries, and beaten on by blows from sticks. Then it stopped with quivering flanks and collapsed on its knees. But the Lanza, whose load he was helping to carry, did not give up. While one of them spoke to the animal lovingly and kindly in German and Russian, the other was already holding a stick ready to drive it on again. They continued until the horse once again moved forward with the courage and the power of desperation. Then the nag collapsed again, for good, out of sheer exhaustion. The men began to curse, and it took a long time until weapons and equipment were unloaded. When years later I read Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, when I was reading of Raskolnikov's dream, I had to think of that image. The devastated Nikolka with blood-rimmed eyes swings the jemmy over his horse, breaking out into the cry of, "It is my property, it is my property." My voice had become so hoarse that it was hard to make myself understood. It was the result of continually shouting out orders. For the longer my voice lasted, the less the runners needed to run. Marches went on throughout the night, often as much as 30 kilometers. That meant even further for the runners, for in addition to the march that the unit had to make, they had to cover even more ground in carrying messages. At the start of a march, people still carried on conversations, but gradually the men fell silent, silent as the night. At that time I was proud of the state of my feet. They showed no blisters or bruising and had nowhere been rubbed raw. To a certain extent I was an infantryman from the top of my head to the soles of my feet. In fact, the soles of my feet were even more important than the top of my head. To the difficulties of the marches was added hunger. At one time it happened that for 2 days and 2 nights the field kitchen had not come forward. The baggage trains lay too far to the rear, so that in the heat of the day, and as a result of the long transport distances, the food became sour. The bread and the schmierer, proper margarine, had run out. The iron rations, a small tin of fatty meat, and a little pack of hard tack were not allowed to be touched. That would only have been allowed in difficult situations. In the villages, insofar as they were not already on fire, or had already burnt down, there was nothing to find. The poor inhabitants had nothing to leave. One morning, one bright spark found some beehives. The company, that is, we 20 men, licked and slurped with our bare hands at the sticky, sweet mass. The powerful bitterness penetrated into your teeth, and at first made your empty stomach want to throw up. At other times I can recall myself beside fences on which tomato plants were hanging. The tomatoes were green, showing no red at all. We ate gherkins and kohlrabi raw, and hardly cleaned of earth. without ever the dreaded shit setting in. One day the men had sorted out for me a beast of burden. The beast had a stringer's reins, but neither halter, bridle, nor saddle. At first it quite docilely let me get onto it, and with one jump I was up. At that time the battalion was marching in ranks through the night. To sit comfortably on the smooth horse's back, and to be carried by it, was an almost uncanny feeling. But my satisfaction only lasted until we reached the next village. As I was riding past one of the burning houses, a glowing beam fell down and sparks flew up. My horse took fright, gave a jerk and bolted with me. It charged off at a gallop. I passed other fires and passed the long ranks of the battalion, marching slowly one behind the other. I was not able to subdue the nag, and losing my balance came off its back. Slipping to the left, I was simply unable to let go of the string that served as reins. With my right foot, I hung over the crupper and held myself under the horse's neck as it raced through the village with me. Then it calmed down, or else the load on its neck had become too heavy. Snorting, it finally stopped, was calm again, and let me remount as if nothing had happened. But the involuntary and dangerous comedy of my situation had a cheering effect, and the good-natured ribbing that I received did not upset me. On the 4th of October, word came that we were reaching the final line, and the withdrawal was completed. That news gave new life to our tired bodies and spirits. The battalion commander announced that the new position was well constructed, and that the field kitchens were waiting with masses of food. Frontline combat packs and fresh lice-free underwear were to be issued. There were also additional rations and a few sweets. Still more important were the announcements that there were replacements for the company. We would once again be topped up to full company strength. 2 kilometres from the new main line of resistance, there lay in our sector the little village of Pupley, because it could offer accommodation to the enemy, and could affect our line of sight and field of fire. Military necessity required that it should be destroyed. Such unchivalrous business had not, until then, been part of our war. But where was there room for chivalry in that war? My company was ordered to set fire to the houses on the right-hand side of the street. There, in the vicinity of Smolensk and the Bolshaya, the highway, the little wooden houses showed more signs of civilization than we had seen until then. It was evident that we were close to the city, as indicated by a brass bedstead that I saw in one house. Apart from a few old people, the inhabitants had left the village. Tears were running over the lined faces of those who had stayed behind. An absolutely ancient man, who had recognized me as an officer, raised his hands. He moaned and asked me to spare the house in which he had lived all his life and where he wanted to die. The old man moved me. It was strange that intensive propaganda and the manifold impressions of the ruthlessness of that campaign had not been able completely to suppress sheer human sensitivity. I struggled with my feelings of duty, and was relieved that my men sympathized with me when I dared them to spare the house of the old man. My company went forward and set fire to the next wooden house with a bundle of straw. The old man tried to kiss my hands and wished me a long life. Waving away his thanks, I stressed to him that he should take care that the flames did not spring from the neighbouring house onto his. If among the men there had been a bigwig or a fanatic, I would have risked a court-martial on account of that old Russian. But there were none of that kind among us. Once a man was among front-line soldiers, he soon relearned his true values. In the evening we moved into the new position. The company sector was well located. The position, on a low slope, had a good field of fire and line of sight over a depression in the ground. On the other side the terrain climbed again, flat, towards the smouldering village. Whether the old man's house had remained intact could not be seen because of the smoke and the trees that were still in leaf. To a certain extent the trenches were reasonably well constructed, but in numerous places really flat. There had not been enough time to construct bunkers, such as we had been accustomed to in our trench warfare. Nevertheless, we found some quite large holes in the ground, about the length of a man and 150 centimetres deep. Many had been covered with a thin layer of wooden beams. I set up my command post in such a hole. In it there was room for 3 men. A couple of arms full of hay saw to it that there was a bit of warmth in the early autumn nights that were becoming chilly. The field kitchen had actually arrived. There were gigantic portions of warm Leberwurst with Stampfkartoffeln. Since the amount of rations in combat did not match the current complement of the unit, The portions for dead and wounded comrades were given to the living. That had less of an effect in the case of food, as in any case you could not eat more than your fill. But in the case of schnapps, tobacco and frontline combat packs, those who remained enjoyed the extra. Not a few fathers of families sent home their surplus food. I sent a parcel of it to my 9-year-old sister Liesel. It was a special blessing that the field post was then distributed. During the withdrawal, it had not reached us. Within 3 days I received 25 letters. On the 8th of October I was able to reply to 5 letters from my mother. In that letter I wrote that the physical exertions were soon likely to be at an end, but we were still living without any extras. For 4 weeks I had not been able to wash, shave, or clean my teeth. Replacements had also arrived. To my surprise, among them there were men from Lorraine and Luxembourg. Their homeland was then part of the Reich, and they had become eligible for military service. They did not seem too enthusiastic. Most of them seemed anxious and were obviously badly trained. A tall blond man from Dudeling made an optimistic impression and found his feet straight away. On the other hand, it seemed that during the night another Unteroffizier had disappeared. No one had seen him go, and nowhere had he given any hint of leaving. Kaczmarek, an Upper Silesian who was about 40 years old, spoke Polish and Russian well, and had only been a few weeks at the front. Otherwise, he had always been with the baggage trains. It was painful for me to realize that the man must have gone over to the enemy. In the early morning of the 5th of October, I was wakened by the rattle of our MG-42S and the clear sound of Russian machine pistols. With my 2 runners, I jumped up to the main trench. A Fahnenjunker came running to meet me with the words, "The Ivans are here." I took him by his lapels, said that he should come with me, and hurried on. In the trench there lay a dead Russian. With my machine pistol drawn, I felt my way around the corners of the trench, the runners behind me. One of the runners shouted, "There they go!" We had come a little too late to repulse the assault unit. Our reliable Feldwebel Geisel had been there before us. The last 2 Ivans fled, then collapsed under our rifle fire in the area between the lines. 2 gave themselves up. 3 lay dead in the trench, among them the leader, a junior lieutenant. We examined his papers. The newcomers to my unit, who had not yet seen any dead Russians, approached the bodies with curiosity. They were surprised at the primitive nature of the Russians' equipment. We oldies were surprised by the oversized officer's epaulets that the junior lieutenant was wearing. The previous year they had not had those historic Russian insignia of rank. But by then the great patriotic war declared by Stalin had begun. By then it was no longer the workers' fatherland, but Mother Russia who was in danger, and who had called her sons. In the meantime, Oberstleutnant Dorn had relieved Novak in 3rd Battalion, and had taken over command of the regiment. In the evening he inspected the sector and received reports about the morning visit of the enemy. It is true that he did not call me Booby, as Novak had done in the summer, but like Novak, he was really paternal. On his belt buckle, he had a field flask dangling from which he offered us drinks. It was good, warming cognac. The hope for a period of rest in the Pupley sector had proved impossible. On the night of the 12th of October, we had been relieved and had moved into the baggage train village, some 10 kilometres away. Until midday, we had been able to sleep without the disturbing influence of the enemy. Transport, on lorries northwards to the taxiway, was planned for the afternoon. There, one of the combat actions was underway. In the history of the war in Russia, they were called the Smolensk Highway Battles. The Russians had continued to attack and had made critical breakthroughs. We spent the night of the 13th of October in the village of Lenino. The company had been topped up to 70 men, and I had found them quarters in 2 rooms of a Russian house. The conditions were dreadfully cramped. The only way to get some sleep was side by side, all huddled in one direction. It was impossible to turn over because the whole chain would have become tangled up. The stench, the cramped conditions, and the lice saw to it that our rest did not develop into a recuperative sleep. Again and again a man would start up, tormented by lice. Then, in addition, there was an owl in the night. It was a Soviet biplane, well known to us from our trench warfare. Since my night ride in Jelnya, I was sensitive to that aircraft, so there was to be no hope of falling asleep. In actual fact, the owl did drop some shrapnel bombs. At the unit dressing station, I found half of my company. Only 15 men out of 70 had remained unwounded. 20 must have been killed. I myself had been incredibly lucky. The first shot had clipped the surface of my stomach in 2 places. The second had neatly gone between 2 ribs over the spleen. I just about managed to walk unaided, with my upper body bent forward. The wounded were driven back on the assault guns. I was lifted on with Feldwebel Geisler, whose forearm had been lacerated by an explosive shell. At the regiment we were unloaded into Sankas, the medical motor vehicles that took us to the railway at Gorki. There a hospital train was standing ready. I had found time to report to the commander over the failed operation. I learned that the 1st and 2nd companies had not reached the trenches of the main line of resistance. Oberstleutnant Dorn shook his head sadly over the badly prepared and precipitate adventure. It had been taken out of his hands as a commander. The battalion had been put under the command of the 2nd unit. I can still remember the feeling of indescribable relief as I lay in the moving hospital train. The train's destination was Vilna and was reached via Minsk. During the journey, I looked out through the porthole of the wagon, a converted cattle truck. I saw an unforgettable picture. From the west shone the setting sun. In its reddish light lay a broad land, with no houses, no trees, no bushes. On the northern horizon there was the wall of a thunderstorm, blackish violet. In front of it, lonely and distant, there rested a whitewashed stone church. I wrote home about my 2 shots in the stomach, and that I did not expect a lengthy stay in hospital. But after 10 days, the wound made by the shot in my stomach had become inflamed and had to be operated on. The surgeon was a staff medical officer of about middle age, red-haired, small and compact. He made fun of my officer's nappishness as I woke from the effects of the ether. Still under its influence, I rambled on about how nice it had been to pass, fully conscious, into unconsciousness. All responsibility was taken from me, and all thoughts of duty and compulsion fell away. The sceptical expression on the surgeon's face told me that he did not know what I was talking about. He probably had no idea of the burden of responsibility placed on the shoulders of a 19-year-old company commander. After leaving the operating table, I said, "Thank you, sir," as was appropriate. But he was none the wiser. "Don't mention it, my boy," was his answer in reply to the thanks which I had meant so seriously. The military hospital was in a convent hospital, an old building with thick walls. I have a fleeting recollection of Helena, a Polish medical student, who was on duty during the day. On the other hand, I can still clearly picture the night sister with whom I had conversations every evening. She was a 70-year-old nun who belonged to the house. She was a cultured lady from the Polish nobility and a widow of 44 years. In fluent German, she told me, her interested listener of her short youth, long ago. She had lived in Warsaw and had stayed in Paris and London. For years she had done only night duty. Perhaps, in that way, she felt closer to the eternal night. Every day an 11-year-old girl came into the hospital selling newspapers. The child was obviously undernourished. Somehow she affected all the comrades in the room. We joined ourselves together into a benevolent society for her family by always paying 10 or 20 times too much for her 10-pfennig newspapers. Her eyes shone with thanks. On the 3rd of November, when we were loaded up into Sankas and driven to the station, our little girl waved after us for a long time. To my delight, the hospital train travelled to Wernigerode in the Harz, a lovely spa town. In its situation, and because of the Harz landscape, it reminded me of Sonneberg and the Thuringian forest. On the way, some of the wounded were unloaded in Halberstadt. I have no recollection of the town, but I certainly do recollect that a gigant flew over it. That was the Wehrmacht's new large transport aircraft. A tank or a whole company of soldiers could be transported in it. The gigantic plane, with its 6 engines, 3 on each wing, made a lasting impression on us wounded men, particularly because of the noise it made. It seemed to us to be a sign that the power of the Reich was anything but broken. Wernigerode was the earlier residence of Prince Stolberg Wernigerode. His great castle was situated above the town and towered over it. Noble hotels and old half-timbered houses were characteristic of the town. It was a home to a series of sanatoria, into one of which I was sent. It was the house called Dr. Kayenburg. Evidently it was named after a doctor, but was run by his widow. In it, 20 officers were accommodated whose wounds were not particularly serious, and who were all capable of walking. The doctor came every day on his rounds from a military hospital. A full sanatorium regime prevailed. To me, it was an unaccustomed feudal environment. There was a radio in the room, a balcony with a view onto the Brocken, and billiards in the billiard hall. The food was good, but there were only a few cigarettes, I complained in a letter to father. Of my officer comrades of all ages, I still remember 3. My roommate was an Augsburg clergyman's son, Lieutenant Uttmann. After me, he was the youngest. A cavalry Oberleutnant of the Bamberg cavalry was Herr Langen from Munich. He was from the publishing family Langen and Müller, and very cultivated. A friendly man was the reserve Oberleutnant Dr. Wutzel. He was a German scholar and an art historian. He was from the 45th Infantry Division, the Linz Division. He later received the Knight's Cross and after the war was a Hofrat in the office of the Austrian provincial government. To get from the sanatorium into the town, we travelled one stop on the Brocken Railway, a narrow-gauge railway. It travelled from the Wernigerode main station to the Brocken, the highest mountain in the Harz. We often went to the café in the afternoon or evening. Once we even went up the Brocken thinking, as we did so, of Goethe's Faust and the witches on the Blocksberg. In a letter of the 5th of December, from Wernigerode to father, I note that I had been at home in Stockerau on a short special leave. I told him of a fine performance of La Traviata in the State Opera. However, I added that the only problem was that the tenor had been rotten, as is almost always the case in Vienna. But I did not like at all what was going on around my family at home. I liked it so little that I often said you would really like to punch them. It was the moan-ers on the home front that I cursed in a Christmas letter to Rudy. Their lordships do not deserve the sacrifices made at the front, I wrote. It has the effect of throwing me into a screaming rage. Then I begin to mock them, so I get dreadfully on the nerves of many people, especially girls. I told Rudy that I had been together a lot with 2 of his classmates, Egon Papritz, nicknamed Kitty, but who was later killed. The other was Ernst Vogel, nicknamed Avis. After the war, he became a factory owner and a well-known contemporary composer. With those 2 friends, I joined in one evening in a poker game. But I was a beginner. In fact, I gambled so badly that at the end of the evening I had lost an entire month's salary. The main complaint of my letter was about the fact that my girl wasn't there for me. I closed the letter asking when we would see each other again, because I had the feeling that the war would only last another year at most, God willing. In Wernigerode, I had another letter from the company clerk, Unteroffizier Wolf. In it, he told me about what had happened to my company after I left. Wolf wrote that, in accordance with my letter, the recommendations had been made for decorations for the men, namely the 2 medics. In the barrage fire in front of the cemetery at Assorowo, they had heroically done their duty. It was the chaplain, Unteroffizier Jaschek, whom I had put in for the Iron Cross First Class, and Obergefreiter Boilecker, whom I had recommended for the Iron Cross Second Class. Wolf continued, after the heavy casualties of the 15th of October, the company was topped up again. At the end of November we were taken back by rail to Neville. From the 8th of November we had more heavy casualties, 20 dead and 50 wounded. Lieutenant Ludwig, who had taken over command of the company, was also wounded. Major Brauer and the battalion adjutant, Lieutenant Buchsch, were killed in action. I wish the Herr Lieutenant a really good convalescence, and I hope to see you again soon. Company leaders of your calibre, with a fresh and daring spirit and filled with concern about the welfare of the men in the trenches, do our people good. Then it will be easier to master the difficult tasks that face us.